right, how are you guys doing? Good. I'm Maggie. Thanks for giving me a second there. All right, I gave this talk as a webinar that you could call into last year. So that was a bit longer. I'm going to go kind of quickly through the slides because I want us to be able to talk to each other. So, put on your seatbelts. All right, I'm getting my PhD in education. I have an MS in biology. So getting my PhD in education has taught me so much about what I do, right? I teach most of the time and do research some of the time, right? So I am going to kind of talk to you about the science behind what we do, and then I'm going to ask you to share back with us what you think you might want to share with other people, what's working for you. So I'm giving you an open invitation to mess around with your devices while I'm talking. So you could be prepared for that at the end, okay? So does everyone know what metacognition is? Can someone offer a definition? Hence the talk. Good to see ya. I haven't seen you in a long time. Okay, yeah, it's thinking about thinking, okay? So it's not a complicated concept, but we do it per our personalities, right? We're professors. We're constantly thinking about thinking. But we have to model this cognitive strategy to our students. They don't necessarily do it. So I'll tell you my punchline right now. Tell your students what you're doing, right? Don't just teach them, tell them why you're doing it the way you're doing it. And so we want to end this half an hour having some new ideas and tools in our toolbox. So why do we do what we do? Do we think it works, and why do we think it works? And also at CCC Online, unlike other schools, we work really closely with IDs and master courses. So I really want to bring us to an understanding of why we do that. Because after almost 10 years of being here, I feel like there's a lot of grumbling about master courses versus having more autonomy. But we want to see how it's an improved system when we work with an instructional designer. So essentially, we start really big, systems theory, right? We don't just teach as ourselves anymore. We don't just go into the classroom. Our students have a whole learning experience, and there are certain things that they're going to expect to be fairly stabilized. The system has to be stabilized. When the system is not a well-running system, then the externalities get confusing, and that's really important for our students in the online classroom. If every class is different, then they're trying to figure out what you want from them and what they need to do rather than learning the science, right, or the whatever topic you teach. And so in the systems theory, we have this whole diagram where we put stuff in and we process it and we have an output and we think about it and start over. Does this look like anything that you might be familiar with in terms of our design process? It's kind of like backwards design. So you might have heard of that, or the ADDIE model, okay? So how we design the class is different from how we teach it, right? We have this system in place that we are going to operate in. We're going to get in the car that the IDs create with us, and we're going to drive it, right? If we just go in by ourselves, each experience that we provide is unique, and that can be difficult for students in the online environment. So, you know, you might be really good at decorating the living room, but you probably are going to suck at making the living room a pretty comfortable place to be if you don't have that engineer there to make the house itself a sound structure. So thinking about that, that's the system we work in. So I didn't know any of this stuff till I started my PhD. So maybe you know it, maybe you don't. Let's just go real quick. I'm sure you know about Pavlov, nod vigorously. If so, okay. Way back in the mid-20th century, we were like, why do humans do what they do? How can we influence that behavior? And so we really didn't know that much about the brain. We just thought that it was kind of like a response, you know, a subconscious response. And so your job as the teacher is to create the right stimuli to get the response you want, right? Submit that paper on time. How are you going to make that happen? Now, we moved into a world where we had electron microscopes. We started to understand the brain a lot more because we could see into it and see where the neurons were firing. And so we started to think that learning was about thinking. Do you think learning is about thinking? Yeah, it is. It has something to do with thinking, right? But in the early rendition of cognitivism, we really thought, hey, thinking impacts behavior, therefore thinking is not a behavior, okay? That they're separated. But we want to train the mind to learn to think. So that goes back to that metacognition thing. Then we got into kind of like the hippy-dippy phase where we were like, it's all about your experience and what you do living through it, right? The teacher all of a sudden is no longer very important because it's like you just create the world and let people play in it and they'll learn. Okay, so that's constructivism, that you're going to construct your knowledge. And now we get to the modern age where we have this thing called the internet, right? And the construction of the knowledge isn't really something that we drive. We don't necessarily build the house. Now the students build the house, right? So we teach them how to do that by teaching them how to access information successfully, efficiently, academically. And so connectivism is the last piece of this puzzle that we're really learning in a digital age in a completely different way, because we're not driving the behavior, the students are driving their own behaviors. So here's just a quick summary, but essentially the range is, are you in control or the students in control, okay? And which one drives learning faster, okay, or more efficiently? You have to come to terms with this, right? Because if you want them to be creative, and we're being told that they have to be, right? The 21st century skill is to be able to think, going back to metacognition, to be a creative thinker, okay? But if you live in an environment in the master course where it's like really, really, really rigid, you are restricting that thinking process, right? Because you're saying, I want you to go out and self-direct, but it has to fit into this little tiny box that I've created for you. We don't want that confusion for them, right? Also, no one lives in one of those places. No one is a behaviorist, a cognitivist, a constructivist, and nothing else, right? When I first started learning about this stuff, I wanted to put myself in the constructivism box, but I really am driven by that cognitivism piece. And so I had to decide after a while it was okay to be more than just one definition. Okay? And so we use the instructional design theory to help us figure out how we're going to order our thinking as instructors, okay? And we live in this mediated environment, and so really it's the classroom that the IDs create for us that is that place of knowledge. It's not really what we know. What we know is almost not important in the online environment. How we train students to know is much more important, okay? So when we put together these course maps, we see how it all fits together, and we understand before we go into it what the outcome should be. And this is super important to us because we're a service provider, we're not a college. So we have to be able to account for what we're doing in order to keep our contracts with all the home colleges, right? But here are just some stats. This is not from this year, so I'm sure these numbers are much larger. But we have tons of students and tons of people who are coming into our online learning environment, and we have to be good at what we do. We cannot be just okay at it, okay? So I'm going to stop there, and I have, well, close your eyes. I'm going to flip through several slides. And I'm going to talk just quickly about some examples that I've come up with. And then I want you to think about what you're doing in your classroom, okay? So how can you include experiential learning in the classroom? So what I'm saying here is that I have not found many opportunities to do this at TC online, but we see our students go out and try different things. So looking at this example, define nonverbal communication. Recognize various nonverbal cues and their effect on the customers. Explain the effect that gender has on communication. Describe the effect of culture on okay? That's the discussion post. So thinking about that, how could we do something like that in the online classroom? How can we get them to go out and do something and come back to our discussion and bring that experience back home? Same thing here. This is a science activity where they're going to go out and they're going to walk between the planets, okay? And so they're like experiencing how the relative distances of the planets. Now, I've also been trying to increase my student learning with group work. This is super challenging. The most challenging thing I've ever tried to do because, like I said before, you know, the teacher is not really at the center anymore, but I've had to really help to drive this. So if anyone has anything they want to share about group work, I find that the group work is very authentic and I get excellent outcomes, but it's very difficult to set up the expectations, like what if one student doesn't show up, right? How does that affect everybody else? And then finally, other things you can do to engage your students, just make the old lecture video, right? I think that is all of our first goals when we become online professors, is to have some kind of media presence, right? But maybe this is not the best approach for all the things that I just talked about. So those were just some learning objects, ideas that keep coming up in our newsletters and different things that we should be trying. So at this point, I want you, maybe just with the people you're sitting with, to kind of sit for a moment quietly and think like, are you trying something new? And is it working? And if it is, why is it working? Is it working because you're teaching them what you know? Is it working because they're creating their knowledge? Or are you teaching them how to think? Okay, so try to think about that, and I'll keep those slides up about constructivism, cognitivism, and connectivism, so you can be sort of thinking about that, because in the end, you want to be able to say to your students, we're doing this because this is going to help you learn for these reasons, and just say that in the announcements and in the news. You don't have to just talk about your content, you can talk about how you're driving their learning forward. So I will stop, turn towards your neighbors, talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes, and we will go from there. Okay, so I'm going to have you just, if you could just go around and share back with us. The idea here really is for you to think about what you're doing, help your students think about what they're doing in the learning environment, and also get new ideas, right? Sometimes the person sitting next to you has the best 5-second idea, and you could implement it at lunch on your computer. So, yes.
One thing I do, I teach math,
Okay.
and discussions are always really hard. So I will do a weekly chit chat, and it is completely not related to math at all, and it just gets the students in the area talking about their personal situations, and sometimes we tell jokes, and it kind of just gets them in the forum and interacting with each other, and they become a little more comfortable with discussions in general.
Awesome, that sounds great. And we have learned in our research that social development is super important. That's why you have to go and say hi to every student in the first week, even if they give you 70 2 classes for that social engagement. So I thank you for that. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm teaching medical terminology, and one of the options on a discussion is to go out into their workforce. Some of them are working in health professions already, but to interview somebody that may be a profession that they're working toward. So have an interview and be able to talk to that person and ask them certain questions, and then bring it back into the discussion about that particular profession and what that person actually does and what they like or don't like about their job. So it's practical.
Yeah, and that gets at that first thing of how can you bring the experiment or experiential learning back, you know? That's a great idea. I love that. Yes.
So kind of a segue to that, we talked about the same thing, interviewing, observation, community, and then the topic changed to what do you do when you have a student who's kind of an avoidant learner who says, well, I took online classes so I wouldn't have to go do stuff like that. And So it just kind of got me thinking about, well, maybe they can make phone calls. Maybe there's another way that they can work on that connective piece that I think is integral to learning. Learn so that you can connect.
I urge you to not back down. You know, so before the assignment opens, make a little video and be like, this is why we're doing this. Sure, maybe you think, gee, I don't have time, you know, but, and then you're showing them why that's important.
Right.
And I always say to students, like, yeah, group work sucks. But guess what? Every work environment is group work, you know, except maybe if you're writing a book in the woods. So, yeah. Okay, anyone else? Yes.
So I didn't do it for, I did for CNC. I plan to switch it over to it here, but essentially it's environmental science class. I have them choose a specific spot, a specific habitat type that they are fond of at the first of the semester. And then, so then they go through doing, you know, developing a plan for how they're going to find out how this place functions, okay? And what's dysfunctional about it as well. So they have to start off with doing a speaking spot. It has to be a wild, at least a semi-wildland. Then they have to, and they have to do all the map stuff for it. And then they have to interview the people who are associated with that wildland. And so they have to go to Fish and Wildlife Service people, BLM or whoever, to do those interviews, et cetera. And then they have to develop essentially an assessment of that wildland and what is being impacted by both negatively and positively. But then, and they have to do about 3/4 of the way through the semester, and then they have to, I pick who has to exchange. So they have to exchange their products at that point with other students. And